Civil Liberties Australia is what CLA stands for, and it was established 20 years ago by a couple in Canberra who were becoming increasingly concerned about injustices and the widening gap between corporations and the rest of us in Australia. The incarceration rate, the increasing surveillance laws, and the need for a Human Rights Act to deal with this across the nation. CLA were at Parliament House this morning for an hour for a silent protest because we're trying to change what we can't accept, which is police investigating police. What worries us about police investigating police is that the Corruption and Crime Commission in Western Australia was set up in order to oversee the police as ordinary human beings like us. But in fact, the Corruption and Crime Commission are no longer particularly interested in what the police are doing. So our incarceration rates are rising by 3 times the amount in the past 10 years as previous to that. We're finding that individual injustices as a result of police behaviour are being ignored or dismissed by politicians. So we need a Human Rights Act to address all Australians, and WA is very reluctant to enter into negotiations about that. And the incarceration rate itself is the outcome of police behaviour, trying to put notches on their belts. And the censorship and lack of rights in our prisons is terrifying when we realise these people are going to be released into the community, not having been rehabilitated, with nowhere to live, no potential means of making having an income or having a career. And so the recidivist rates, which is people going back to prison, are rising as well. So the overall cost of that is colossal on the taxpayer. So that pretty well sums up what the reason for being outside Parliament House this morning. The Indigenous incarceration rate in Western Australia is internationally infamous. We have the highest rates of Indigenous incarceration in the world in this wealthy state of ours. It beggars belief. And not only that, we're locking up Aboriginal children as well. And Civil Liberties has that as front and centre of our letters to politicians at the moment. This is an outrage, at a time when we're supposed to be closing the gap. The effects of Indigenous incarceration in WA are first and foremost immensely costly to the taxpayer. That's the first thing. If you're worrying about money and waste of money, it is a colossal waste of money, because we could be spending that money on creating decent housing, health for Indigenous communities, education for their young. But as things stand, what we're doing is seeing deaths in custody rise. So it's almost as though it's out of control, and no matter how much we campaign or canvass politicians, we're not really being heard, because we're getting letters from the Corrective Minister and the Attorney General telling us that this is something they're beginning to deal with, without being particularly specific. So we have to trust them. And I'm afraid trust in politicians now has reached an all-time low. So we have to keep pushing. The Indigenous incarceration rate is equivalent in CLA's mind to genocide. The cost on all of us of Indigenous and regular incarceration is that more and more people are being locked up, and a lot of them are suffering mental health conditions, which was the problem in the first place. And so that's not being addressed. And so those prisoners who do emerge after their sentence, eventually, will have a devastating impact on the community in the years to come, because they will be desperate people. Family and domestic violence is a real big problem at the moment. Apparently police are called out every 4 minutes to a family or domestic violence incident across the state, possibly across the nation. But in Western Australia, we explored why many women who are being beaten up find themselves incarcerated instead of the reverse. And interestingly, domestic violence amongst police themselves is big. In the past year, I've had 7 ex-police wives contact me, but desperate to remain anonymous. They experienced awful brutality from very stressed police, and I want to make it clear that the police themselves are often very distressed and stressed, which is another reason why we want oversight, fair and equal oversight. We want them treated like ordinary people. But the domestic violence incidences amongst police are terrifying, and the wives are too frightened to speak up. They were too frightened to join us this morning. And not only that, many of their children have fled the state. Now this is, just to have 7 ex-wives come to CLA in 1 year is remarkable, because they've also wanted to run away after they've let me know what they know. They want me to sort it out and they run away because they're terrified. I find that really, truly shocking. And that without police oversight and addressing the police culture for their sake as well as ours, for their families' sakes as well as ours, then this will just continue, and I can only see it getting worse. So what I found from Report 15 that was tabled last year in September in Parliament is that in fact the Corruption and Crime Commission are only investigating a tiny, minute number of complaints brought to them by citizens about police bad behaviour. And I have this pie chart here that shows you openly in Report 15 how little the CCC is investigating police. So you might ask, what are the CCC doing? Who are they investigating? And the fact is that they apparently are investigating political and bureaucratic corruption, which I'm sure exists, I'm certain of that. But let's face it, there are only 95 politicians in this state, and there are 9,000 plus police and support services. So my opinion, and I think many people's opinion, is that the police are responsible for the moral decline and loss of hope of citizens in this state, and that we don't need a $12 million commission investigating political bad behaviour. Surely they can do that amongst themselves. The Corruption and Crime Commission, which is known as the CCC in WA, was set up to investigate complaints about police brutality or misconduct across the state, and including all of us in the regions and the city. Civil liberties objectives are to have politicians listen and act, to get politicians to understand isn't just a career. Them taking responsibility for the people they represent. And they've really got to, because if they don't grasp that nettle, we are looking at mayhem in 10 years from now. So Civil Liberties is on a mission. We have got to turn the tide. We've got to get politicians to listen. The justice system in Australia, right across Australia, really needs a complete review. For 200 years, we've had a sort of medieval British system of justice. And we either need a royal commission nationwide into the mess that it has become, or individual state reviews to attempt to clean up and clarify what is happening to the law. It would be worth it for future generations.